The letter arrived on a quiet Monday morning, and it changed everything. What started as a small HOA fee dispute would soon turn into a courtroom battle no one in the neighborhood expected. Daniel Harper had lived in his modest home for nearly 8 years. The house wasn't perfect, but it was his pride. Every weekend he spent hours fixing small things, planting flowers, and keeping the place warm and welcoming. The neighbors often said Daniel cared about the street more than anyone else, but one afternoon, a bright red notice appeared on his front door. It was from the HOA. According to the letter, Daniel had failed to pay several HOA fees. The notice warned that if the balance wasn't paid immediately, further action would be taken. Daniel stared at the number printed at the bottom. It was far higher than it should have been. He knew something was wrong. Daniel had always paid his dues on time, every single month. He even kept records in a small folder inside his desk. At first he assumed it was just a mistake, but when he called the HOA office, the woman on the phone sounded cold and impatient. Her name was Karen Whitmore. She was the president of the HOA board, and she had already decided Daniel was in the wrong. What Daniel didn't realize yet was that this small disagreement over fees was only the beginning of a much bigger storm, because Karen wasn't just sending warnings anymore. She was already planning something that would change Daniel's home forever. And when Daniel finally discovered what she had done, the entire neighborhood would be watching. 3 days later, another letter arrived, but this one wasn't just a warning, it was a final notice. Daniel sat at his kitchen table reading the letter again and again. According to the document, his unpaid HOA balance had now doubled because of penalties and administrative charges. None of it made sense. Daniel opened the folder containing his payment receipts. Every month was clearly documented. Bank confirmations, online transfers, even email confirmations from the HOA office, everything proved the same thing. He had paid every fee. Confused and frustrated, Daniel drove to the HOA office the next morning. Karen Whitmore greeted him with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. She sat behind a large desk, flipping through a file that had Daniel's name printed on it. "Your payments were recorded late," she said calmly. "And the HOA rules are very clear about penalties." Daniel tried to explain. He showed her his payment confirmations, but Karen barely looked at them. Instead, she slid another document across the desk. If the balance wasn't paid within 7 days, the HOA would take property enforcement action. Daniel felt a strange knot form in his chest. Enforcement action? He asked. Karen leaned back in her chair. "Rules exist for a reason," she said, but as Daniel left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about Karen's tone had felt personal. Like this wasn't just about HOA fees anymore. And what Karen planned to do next would prove that feeling was absolutely correct. The morning Daniel returned home from work early, he noticed something strange. Several trucks were parked outside his house. At first he thought a neighbor might be doing repairs, but when he walked closer, his heart sank. Workers were removing parts of his fence. One of them was already pulling down the wooden gate Daniel had built himself years earlier. Daniel rushed forward. "What are you doing?" he shouted. One of the workers pointed toward a clipboard. "HOA property enforcement order." Daniel grabbed the document and read the words carefully. The HOA had authorized structural removal due to unpaid violations. He felt disbelief wash over him. This wasn't just about fees anymore. Karen had ordered workers to start dismantling parts of his property. The garden fence, the decorative lights, even the front steps were marked for removal. Daniel tried calling Karen immediately, but she didn't answer. The workers kept going, piece by piece, while Daniel stood there helplessly watching parts of his home disappear. Neighbors began gathering quietly along the sidewalk. Some looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable, because everyone in the neighborhood knew something important. Daniel was the last person who would ignore HOA payments, and the way this situation was unfolding felt very wrong. But the biggest shock was still coming, because Daniel had already started preparing something Karen never expected. And it would soon bring both of them face to face in court. That evening Daniel sat in his living room surrounded by paperwork, receipts, emails, bank statements. Every document told the same story. The fees had been paid. Daniel realized something important. Karen hadn't just made a mistake, she had ignored the proof completely. The next morning he visited a local attorney who specialized in property disputes. After reviewing the documents carefully, the lawyer raised his eyebrows. "This shouldn't have happened," he said. Daniel explained how workers had already removed parts of his fence and garden. The attorney leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. If the HOA acted without verifying payments, they could be responsible for damages. For the first time in days, Daniel felt a small sense of hope. The lawyer began preparing a case. Photos were taken of the damage, neighbors were contacted as witnesses, and the HOA enforcement documents were carefully examined. but when Karen received the notice about the legal case, her reaction surprised everyone. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. She insisted the HOA had followed every rule. She claimed Daniel had ignored multiple warnings, and she made it clear she was ready to defend her decision in court. The neighborhood quickly learned about the dispute, and suddenly, everyone was paying attention, because the upcoming court hearing wasn't just about one house anymore. It was about whether the HOA had gone too far, and the truth would finally be revealed in front of a judge. The courtroom was quiet when the case finally began. Daniel sat calmly beside his attorney while Karen Whitmore sat across the room with the HOA's legal team. For Karen, this seemed like just another HOA enforcement case, but Daniel's lawyer had prepared something unexpected. The first piece of evidence was simple: payment records, month after month. Daniel's bank statements clearly showed the HOA fees being transferred on time. The judge studied the documents carefully. Karen's attorney argued that the payments had been recorded incorrectly. But Daniel's lawyer wasn't finished. Next came email confirmations sent directly from the HOA system. Each one acknowledged that Daniel's payments had been received. The room grew noticeably quieter. Then the most important evidence appeared: a copy of the HOA internal ledger. It revealed something surprising. Daniel's payments had been recorded correctly from the beginning, but the penalties had been added anyway. The judge slowly looked up from the paperwork. Why were these charges applied if the payments were already confirmed? Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, her confidence seemed to crack, because the evidence told a clear story. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Someone had ignored the records, and the consequences had already damaged Daniel's home. But the judge wasn't finished asking questions yet. And Karen was about to face the moment she never expected. The judge requested one final explanation from the HOA board. Karen cleared her throat and tried to defend the decision. She claimed the enforcement order had been issued because Daniel had failed to communicate properly. But Daniel's lawyer calmly presented one last document. It was an internal email sent by Karen weeks earlier. In the message, Karen had written that Daniel was difficult to deal with and that strict action might teach him to respect HOA authority. The courtroom fell completely silent. The judge read the email twice, then he looked directly at Karen. Did you authorize property removal despite confirmed payments? Karen hesitated. That hesitation said everything. The judge closed the file slowly. This court finds that the HOA acted improperly. The ruling was clear. The HOA would be responsible for repairing Daniel's property and covering legal costs, but the consequences didn't stop there. The judge also recommended a review of the HOA board's leadership. Karen's authority inside the community suddenly looked very fragile, and as the hearing ended, the neighbors who had followed the story closely began talking. Because the real impact of the decision was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood changed in ways no one expected. Word about the court ruling spread quickly. Residents who had quietly accepted HOA decisions for years suddenly started asking questions. At the next community meeting, the room was completely full. Homeowners wanted answers, they wanted transparency, and they wanted leadership they could trust. Karen Whitmore sat at the front table looking very different from the confident president she had once been. One by one, residents spoke about their concerns. Some mentioned confusing fines, others talked about rules being enforced unfairly. For the first time, the HOA board faced real accountability. Within a month, the community voted for new leadership. Karen stepped down as president. Daniel's home was repaired exactly as the court ordered. The fence returned, the garden lights were restored, and the small house Daniel loved finally looked whole again. But more importantly, something else had changed. The neighborhood had learned that rules should apply fairly to everyone, and sometimes, standing up for what's right can bring an entire community together. And that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.